Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hontim from CHI, and welcome to the finale for this year's CHI Innovate 2021 webinar series. Our theme is creating a better normal for healthcare. And actually, this series started in August when we hosted the finals for the Healthcare InnoMatch. Then we witnessed 3 healthcare startups successfully pitch their solutions to 3 CEOs from 3 public hospitals in Singapore. And we're happy to report that the test bidding has already begun in SGH, TTSH, and NUH. We hope to have some good results soon. The following month in September, we then had the honor of hearing 2 of Singapore's leading lights, Aaron Maniam and Melissa Kui, who spoke about how language, metaphors, and the active practice of humaneness has helped us face this pandemic with more resilience and hope. And that brings us to today. We are closing this year's webinar series with the sequel to our hit leadership panel from last year. The focus was and will be on our pandemic leadership journeys from across the globe. And we are really delighted that all of our panelists and our moderator from last year, they come from Singapore, UK, Hong Kong, and Sweden, have all reassembled again. And they're joined also by a wonderful fresh face from New Zealand as well. We have asked them to look back in time and also look forward in time. And I expect that the next hour or so, we're going to have a lot of great insights, hopefully some good foresight, and definitely a touch of bittersweet hindsight as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over now to the wonderful moderator from last year, Emeritus Professor Annie Koh from the Singapore Management University. Annie, thanks for joining us again. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to both the virtual audience and my little audience here at the studio. First of all, I love the title of this panel, so I must say thank you to Hong Yim and the whole team at CHI. I think the idea of the panel strikes back, connotes that we have to keep fighting and the game is not over, and having the voices of the panelists both from last year and from this year, we have a new addition. It's wonderful. But before we get the whole conversation going, I thought it will be great to connect the dots and bring back a little clip from last year so as to remind ourselves what this whole journey in the past 18 months, plus the 6 months that have gone before when we had panel 1. So crew, can you help me a little bit and bring up that little clip from panel 1 last year? So if I were to ask you to express how the last 6 months since January 2020 until now had been, what would you express it as? A sentence, a word? A sigh.
A sigh.
Wow.
3 words, then 4 words. 3 words are courage, not from me, from people around me, resilience, and community. And then the 4 concepts, again, I'm stealing from another great friend, from Becky Margiotta, who runs the Billions Institute in the States. Dig deep, dream big, add zeros, and no heroes.
It's a experience and in many ways a privilege to live through one pandemic, but to have lived through 4 or 5 in the span of 2 decades is really extraordinary. And all I can say is, to sum it up in one word, what I've learned most and what I value and treasure most is solidarity. Solidarity with the people whom we serve, and solidarity with people everywhere.
Fun and a great opportunity, but at the same time, of course, catastrophic for the people that are hit by the pandemic.
So wow, it was a wow for us when we met last year. But I'm going to say that this year, it's going to be a double wow. But I thought it would be most wonderful if we could start with someone who didn't join us last year, but thanks to Prof. Jonathan, we have an amazing woman, Miss Kariana Brooking, and she's the CEO of the Hawke's Bay District Health Board, New Zealand. So Kariana, you saw what the man said. Now we take the perspective of the last 18 months, from July last year till current time, December 2nd. All right, what would you describe the last 18 months have been for you as a CEO of the hospital and the healthcare unit in New Zealand? It could be a word, it could be a sentence.
Oh, kia ora everybody, warm greetings from New Zealand. They've certainly set the bar high. I suppose for me, one of the things that I think about is I am who I've been waiting for, nobody else is coming.
I think we're having a little bit of feedback on the sound. So I'm trying to get it adjusted. I couldn't hear it too well. Okay, I think that's better. Could I get you to repeat, Kariana? Sorry about that.
Yeah. Sure. So one of the things that I think about is I am who I've been waiting for, nobody else is coming. Or we are who we are waiting for, nobody else is coming. It's up to us to get it done, to move it forward, to make it happen.
Lovely. It's up to us. Yeah. And, you know, living with the pandemic, living with the endemic, it's not a situation that we have no control. We can make a difference and we can make reality today look better than it is. I love that statement. And now I'm going to move the floor back to our host, JJ. It was a sigh last year. So if I were to ask you, Prof. Chin JJ, Chairman Medical Board of Tan Tock Seng Hospital and Central Health Singapore, what would be your response in a sentence or a word to what had been happening the last 18 months?
I think the last 18 months was definitely not a typical 18 months. Yet at the same time, it was, like I said, telling Annie just now, it's very paradoxical. On one hand, you know, you're coping with change. On the other hand, as you zoom out, there doesn't seem to be change from day to day. People tell me that they're doing the same thing every day and not allowed to do the same thing every day. And I think that the real challenge is that after the initial wave, which generated a lot of energy and excitement, I think people are trying their best to cope with a longer and more chronic second wave that doesn't seem to produce that much adrenaline. In fact, I think it reminds me of, you know, when kids were young and you take a long drive and they always ask you, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And if you are the driver, after a while, you get a little bit tired of hearing it as well. And you also wonder. And I thought, you know, and many of people are probably somewhat disappointed when this news on Omicron broke out because they thought that we're beginning to see sunlight. But I guess the verdict's not out. We hope it is the sunlight and not the light from an oncoming train. Yeah.
Thank you, JJ. You know, JJ answered the last time with a sigh. I'm so glad he's now a lot more loquacious and has a lot more to say. And I hit on the magic word, paradoxical. And, you know, that journey. How do we tell our people we are not there yet, but we must keep the spirits up? So therefore, it allows me to pivot directly to Prof. Gabriel Leong, Dean of the Lee Ka-shing School of Medicine from the University of Hong Kong. You mentioned some great words last year, Gabriel, that it was an experience and a privilege. After 18 months of living with the pandemic, and not even getting to living with the endemic, because Hong Kong, as part of the bigger China, said that it has to be at 0 before we open doors. What would you describe your last 18 months of journey?
Well, it's actually more than 18 months for me. We started work on COVID on New Year's Eve 2019. Yes. So we're now hitting New Year's Eve within this month of 2021. So it's really 2 years and counting. Yes. And it's been a hell of a ride. And this ride is kind of like all good roller coasters. It's not ending yet. It's not ending yet because I don't think that any part of the world is going to be successfully, completely transitioned to an endemic situation just yet. And particularly, as you put it, China, including the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, are still setting and keeping to an elimination or zero COVID strategy. Now, our friends from Australia and New Zealand were in very, very similar situations up until a few weeks ago. So I think that as we now see, despite lifting of most restrictions earlier on in most of the global north in the Western Hemisphere, you are actually now seeing the imposition of whole population lockdowns again. Of course, continental Europe, particularly Austria, is really the exemplar. And I suspect that you are going to see progressive piling on of these PHSMs, or public health and social measures, as we progress through the next few weeks. Then I suppose we can look forward to some more certainty as the scientific community comes back with a few more answers about the epidemiological, immunological, and virological characteristics of Omicron. We only have educated guesses now, and the emphasis is on the guesses part, not the educated part. And I think in the coming 2-3 weeks, as we approach Christmas, we are going to get more answers. And then we'll probably see the progressive lifting come, let's say, February time in the temperate climate zone in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's still very much a journey, and it's a journey that is not nearly at its end yet. And I would just point you to the fact that, look, you know, there is only so much we can do in terms of scientifically forecasting what may be coming. We also have to recognize that pandemic control, as we progress through the different waves and the different phases of the pandemic, we also progress in terms of relying on different knowledge systems. We also progress from more the natural sciences towards the political sciences. And therefore, we need to bring in those perspectives and really try to make sense and resolve in our own thinking, individually and collectively, how we're going to face this latter phase of the pandemic as we all learn how to transition. And along the way, we are sure to make more mistakes, but hopefully with what we have already learned in the last 2 years, we'll keep those mistakes to a minimum and be able to steer each and every one of us together through the rest of the COVID-19 pandemic. And hopefully by the time we may gather again next year, around this time, we would be much, much, much further along that transition and actually have sight of a global conclusion to this saga. Over.
Thank you, Gabriel. Now, that's not one sentence, that's one lecture. Right? But I get the gist of it.
Occupational hazard.
Yeah. So essentially, it's a learning journey, and we are in this together. And the more we share, the better we are at getting there. So I'm going to go to you. All right, Prof. Jonathan. And Prof. Jonathan Gray is the Director of Improvement and Innovation from Cardiff and Vale University Health Board in the UK. And Jonathan, you gave us 3 words and 4 words last year, and everybody saw that clip. What other words will you give us for this year? And Gabriel says we must not only just refer to the last 18 months since we had the panel, but we should take the whole 2 years journey. So I shall allow you that privilege of the 2 years hindsight. What would you say to our audience in a 1-sentence mode?
Thank you, and firstly, greetings from Wales, and it's a pleasure and an honour to be back with you again. I'm going to keep mine short this time. I was playing with some words last night, and I thought of perhaps the words that are bounded optimism. The idea that leaders can display inspiration, hope, optimism, but that it's tempered by reality. It's been, as Gabriel said, you know, a real rocky ride, a fast ride, ups and downs, and it's sometimes difficult to get the communication and the vision right. So bounded optimism are my 2 words this year.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we'll come back to you on that, because I think that's very difficult to balance, all right? Because it's like telling the kid, getting there. Are we there yet? Getting there. And after a while, people are saying, do we call the bluff? So, you know, how do I continue to be realistic and have bounded optimism when the signs are so unclear? Let's go to Joran, and we are very, very happy to have Joran Henriks back. He is the Chief Executive of Learning and Innovation from Kulturum and all the way from Sweden. Joran, what would you say? You saw opportunity in catastrophe last year. So
Yeah.
where do you see the world today?
I see the world differently, because I think that we have in one way fell apart into different kind of communities depending on who we are. But on the other hand, the communities have come closer to each other. So now I have mentioned twice, and I think that we now are in a situation where if you live in a community where you feel trust, it's a lot more of compassion. You take responsibility for your close friends and relatives. And that brings more conversation, much more of co-design thinking and co-production. And I think that is strengths that can be used and promoted if we get the systems together again.
Thank you, Joran. I love all your all the co-creation, co-community, co-passion. It creates a lot of opportunities for coming together as one humanity. So on that note, I'm going to go through a couple of rounds before I open up for Q&A. And I really would like all my virtual audience to be part of this co-creation with me. We are having a conversation here. We are not giving any lecture, and all of us are on this journey of learning together. Let me switch to Asian time zone and start with Gabriel. Gabriel and JJ, you're my Asian time zone. And I thought it will be really important as leaders in healthcare to think about some things we need to reset. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in the last 2 years learning. What are some of the things you think we can keep, and what are some of the things that we need to change and reset in our respective healthcare system by having gone through this 2 years of journey? I'm going to start with you, Gabriel.
Reset our mindset. I think that's the first and foremost we must do. We keep on saying that we would every time we deal with an outbreak. So in East Asia, we have dealt with more of these perhaps than many others in the global north and in the global south outside of the Eastern Hemisphere. So I think back to, say, if you just go back 100 years, out of the 4 flu pandemics, the most recent and the one in 1918 apparently did not emerge first from East Asia, but the other 2 did. One is called the Hong Kong flu, the other is called the Asian flu. So clearly, they were first detected and quite possibly emerged here. We also had the first instance where flu jumped from chickens to humans back in 97. We also had the same thing happen with a different strain happen in 2013 around the Yangtze River Delta in Shanghai. We also had major hand-foot mouth disease, including in Singapore, of course, over the last 15 years, but very heavily hitting Vietnam and mainland China. We've also got the indelible mark of SARS-1. Both Singapore and Hong Kong were hard hit. And South Korea in Seoul got hit with a fairly large nosocomial outbreak of MERS. And then now we've got COVID. So I think that this sociological imprinting, because of experiential learning, has really taught East Asia quite well. And I think that's really one of the major reasons why we've done, relatively speaking, much better than other parts of the world. And by that same token, I would say if we're going to reset our mindset, perhaps having now lived through or are still living through COVID the world over, maybe we are going to be serious this time about taking precautionary measures, both in terms of revamping our public health infrastructure, which, by the way, every single country hit by SARS-1 ended up with a different cast of characters at the helm of the public health or health ministries. Every single one of them actually reformed and restructured and redesigned their public health infrastructure. And therefore, hopefully, COVID-19 would lead to the same resetting of the mindset of the institutions concerned and the governments concerned, but also at the supranational level. The supranational level, i.e., the last revision to the international health regulations was actually accelerated and catalyzed by SARS. So it was formally ratified in 2005, 18 months after the first outbreak of SARS. And, you know, we said most loudly as a world community, as a global community, that we would revisit the IHR after Ebola in West Africa 2014, 2015. And I sat on all of the global panels doing the postmortem of that outbreak. And we all recommended the same thing. Everybody chimed in, but nothing happened. Otherwise, we would have seen it and it would have come in very handy for COVID. So I hope that this reset of the mindset at the institutional and the governmental and the supranational levels is going to take place. But also, if you actually look at the individual level, and again, I point to the sociological imprinting, but this time on individual psyche. If you look at mask wearing, I think it's more than just Confucius in terms of why East Asian mask wearing is really very, very different than what you might see elsewhere, either in the global south or actually in the Western hemisphere. I think that it's because of that sociological imprinting that we've had, particularly over the last 20 years in our part of the world, that has led us to actually be more adherent and willingly adherent, in fact, demanding that everybody else comply with these measures that are seen often as overly draconian in other parts of the world. And that has to be from the individual level. Are you still going to have that party? Are you going to be compliant with mask wearing? Are you going to be compliant with the fairly intrusive contact tracing? Are you going to be alert to the first symptoms and actually go and do that lateral flow test frequently enough to pick up the earliest clusters? These things we almost take for granted in our societies, but it's not the rest of the world. So I think reset in terms of the individual behavior and the psychological resetting is so important. And finally, just let me say, we need to have a reset in terms of how we think about investment in redundancy. Redundancy in terms of we need a little bit of slack and redundancy in the healthcare system in order to be able to mount surge capacity. You can't surge when you run everything in a just-in-time or just-enough basis. We need to move from just-in-time thinking to just-in-case thinking. And so that building in that redundancy, which we have, especially in Singapore and Hong Kong and the rest of East Asia, think that it's such waste. We must think about that as, well, we would rather not use the inflatable life jackets on airplanes and leave them as a wasteful accessory than to actually have to practice putting them on in the case of actually landing on water. So I think that that's another reset we need to do. And finally, resetting the scientific enterprise. We are still bickering over the production capacity of the proven vaccines. We're still bickering over how we deal with IP, how we deal with the procurement and the release as national stockpiles of raw materials and raw ingredients. And in fact, Omicron is a direct result of the deep inequity and the lack of solidarity in access to vaccines. And that absolutely requires a reset. Over.
Thank you, Gabriel. I will have to ask Gabriel, all right, to give me short answers the next time. But I love the reset, the resetting of the mindset. I think that's a very critical part of leadership. Back to you, JJ. All right. I knew Gabriel was going to be long, so I come to you second. What do you think it's worth keeping? I know he talks about a lot about reset, but there must be something that we've learned that is also worth keeping, you know, from having dealt with the crisis in the last 20 months.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Gabriel, I think, for those wonderful insights. I think that certainly I think it's important after a crisis like this to ask ourselves what has worked and what what should not be changed, but in fact should be enhanced. I think from my very micro view, in contrast to Gabriel's more macro perspective, I think what has really worked well for us this time is this collective leadership that we have adopted in this hospital. And I think collective at various levels, collective leadership between the policymakers and the hospital administrators and management, between the hospital senior management and the middle management and the various team leaders. I think that trust and empowerment is very important. I think trust here is really one of the most critical elements, because without trust, it's going to create a lot of inefficiency. And I think what was really illustrated by this crisis is that while policies are policies, rules are rules, I think when you translate it, there is a big gap between that and translation, because translation at the ground involves accommodating various behaviors and psychology. And as you know, even in a society like Singapore, it can be pretty heterogeneous. And therefore, I think while there are rules and guidelines, I think there has to be the trust that at various levels, different leaders will be allowed to that latitude to make exceptions that are defensible and that are appropriate. I think if rules are put down too rigidly in a time in the crisis, I think it's going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies, and I think let us not forget that the healthcare is at the end of the day a profession of consists of a profession of compassion, and therefore we've seen a lot of tragedies during this whole crisis. People are separated, people die alone, and all that. And I'm glad that what has worked is that I think our policymakers and ministry has given quite a bit of latitude to hospitals to interpret some of these guidelines and empowered us to make some of these exceptions and to be able to manage some of these unique cases on the ground. So I think some of these things should continue. And I think that we benefited from a lot of compact and trust building that was already there. But I must say in these past 2 years, we've been drawing on these reserves quite a bit. And when the second wave came on, we sometimes wondered whether how much there's left in that bank account of ours. But I think that besides the social compact, I must say I'm very impressed with the staff's professionalism. I think that is the other driving force that has driven, and that we must continue to nurture and develop in the coming generations of professionals, healthcare professionals, that professionalism, that regardless of the conditions, I will deliver that level of care. And we've seen our staff wearing, full PPE from morning to night, having ulcerated skin on the face and all that. But you don't hear any complaint, because I think people have found meaning in what they do. So that I think this sort of trust building model of leadership, care delivery, organizational culture is something that we should continue. And I think the other thing that we've done quite well this time is a very early proactive attention to the staff's mental health and developing various programs because if we can't help ourselves, if we ourselves are collapsing, how are we going to help our patients? And I think we do see the challenges when we came to the second wave, where rally calls that were very effective in the first wave no longer have this impact. But I think approaches such as being candor, empathy. I'll just give an example. When I think overseas leave were relaxed, I think we see almost a unquestioned sort of attitude from our local staff to allow our foreign staff to have the priority to go back to the country to see the families. And I think that comes from this kind of social compact, the kind of empathy that the whole community has as a whole community of caregivers, that we also take care of our colleagues. That's right. And I think that is something that we want to continue. And I think that cannot be built overnight during a crisis. It has to be there in between crises, and it has to be there all the time, and it needs to take a deep root as a sort of a culture. And I think so. These are some of the things. I totally agree with Gabriel that I think that perhaps we were a little bit of a victim of our previous efforts in our lean culture. We were so lean that there was hardly any fat when the crisis came. And without that sort of redundancy, really, we couldn't stretch. And our staff did stretch, but everyone is actually very, very
Running
tired.
low.
Yeah. And the other reason why we need that redundancy also is that in a crisis like this, a lot of efforts are then dedicated to battling the epidemic. But let us not forget that there are still patients with heart conditions, cancer conditions, the run of mill, what we call business as usual sort of work. You need that redundancy to be able to keep that going, because you can't be fighting on one front while you have enemies on various fronts. Yeah. So it's not one of the situations where you can put everything down and be COVID fighters. I think people are now becoming more and more aware of the sort of collateral damage from devoting all our attention to COVID. And therefore, we do need that redundancy to be able to keep the critical services going. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I totally agree. I hear all the magic words, resetting the mindset, but keeping some of that collective leadership and the humanity that we have learned, and that empowerment and trust.
Yeah.
I would love to switch gears now and get to Kariana first. Yeah, Kariana, I know New Zealand have been a model in the last 2 years in many ways. And then, of course, with that recent change and pivot in policy, maybe you could share with us, how do you communicate that change to your own staff? And how do you, bring down that communication from the country level to the healthcare sector and to your own institution?
Yeah, thanks for that.
That's the rebalance part that we wanted you to talk about.
I mean, everything is a balance, isn't it? And just to pick up from Gabriel, New Zealand in the last 2.5 years have gone from emergency to emergency. We had the Christchurch terror attack, and then we had the measles outbreak, and then we had the Whakaari White Island volcanic explosion. And so our health system for 9 months went from one emergency management response to another emergency management response to another emergency management response, then to COVID. So as a country, we really did adopt the team of 5 million. However, it does feel by December 2021, it's a little frayed at the edges. And I think it is because we are constantly balancing a series of things, both as individuals and also within our health and disability system. So New Zealanders had become accustomed to the notion of elimination. Like All Blacks, like the All Blacks of New Zealand, we're winners. And so to give up the concept of elimination, something we held so dearly, for every New Zealander seemed quite a jolt. And we're still working our way through it. And in working our way through it, we have in a little way become slightly tribal, which is counterproductive to the team of 5 million. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There does really feel like a team of 5 million New Zealanders in New Zealand and a team of 1 million New Zealanders trying to get back into New Zealand. And they feel really deeply affected that although they have a right to come home, they don't get to come home. The South Island likes to point out to the North Island for a very long time they didn't have cases. So why were they asked to make the same sacrifices as another island that forms the 2 beautiful islands of New Zealand? But why were they asked to make the same sacrifices? Auckland on December the 15th will come out of the longest lockdown New Zealand has ever had. And it almost feels like there's Auckland and the rest of New Zealand. And so there's these tensions that evolve. And as a leader, in a part of the North Island who only in the last year has had 2 COVID cases. Everybody protects whatever's going on very fiercely, very parochially. So I just think that we need to rebalance the conversation, and part of me being a leader in our local health system is to really talk people through, enable them to express that. And of course, now we're facing the concept of those that are vaccinated and those that are not vaccinated. And what are the freedoms that people are able to have based on their vaccination status. And that has caused, again, a large amount of social discussion a large amount of polarizing views between those who believe that they got vaccinated as part of the social contract, and those that have chosen not to get vaccinated, that they're exercising their personal choice ahead of everybody else. So for me as a leader, these are really complex human things to work with for staff. You would think that you wouldn't need to have a conversation with staff around rights for individuals to be treated irrespective of vaccination status. Yet there are people for whom you have to have that conversation with. And so I do believe as a leader, this is such a relational time at the moment, because a large number of people have surpassed the science, and they're creating their own narrative that is often at odds with somebody else's, somebody in their family, someone who lives next door to them, someone who's been their friends for an incredibly long time. So I think there's this underlying potential for conflict, which is really tough, because in New Zealand, we like to consider ourselves to be kind and peaceful people. And yet these moments where it can just flash into a very large cacophony of noise. I think probably the only other two things that I will say is, you really, I think as a leader across our health system, and I'm very conscious of this with other leaders, is that we always concentrate on the humanity of the workforce versus the workforce as a commodity. You know, we're very often asking more and more, and every time people step up and up, and it just almost feels like a dangerous balance of once more to the brig go I. And the humanity of that can sometimes get lost in the need to meet the need. And so for me, from a leadership perspective, you have to remain incredibly human about what's happening within your workforce and within your community. Every Monday night, I attend a Zoom with all of the mayors from the community that I work within, all of the members of parliament from the community I work within. Honestly, it feels like I'm going to the principal's office every week. They critique the week before. They try not to critique my performance, but I do take it, quite personally. But I mean, as a leader, you've got to be calm and balanced and reflective. About the place that you find yourself in. One last thing, I do completely support the idea of investment balance. I think we've been really wanting more funding to be spent in early intervention, prevention, promotion, public health matters. We've spent more money than we'd like to think about on testing and PPE, on contact tracing, on isolation, on vaccination, important things. But imagine if we'd invested that in public health at all. What would look different?
Very nice, Kariana. And I really love the passion you have about looking beyond just the physical needs and the mental needs. Yes, and I think those are the key points that keep coming up. I'm going to move to Prof. Jonathan Gray now. So while we have reset, we have rebalanced, it's so critical to rebuild. And I hear from Gabriel, we need to rebuild with redundancy. We need to rebuild with the human aspect in mind. I would love to hear from you, Jonathan. When I mention the word rebuild for sustainability, what comes to your mind?
Thank you, and thank you, Kariana. It's wonderful to hear your passion and enthusiasm and skill again. I've missed that. I wanted to share a couple of thoughts on this, and I thought I'd start with one of my teachers, and I think it gives us a context for this conversation. A wonderful man called Marshall Gans once said that leadership is accepting the responsibility to create the conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. And sometimes over the last 2 years, I've had to fall back on that and think, what's my role in this? And then let me sort of take you somewhere slightly different as well. If you think about that and then you put on top of that, and I don't know who said this, it was said to me in one of those acute situations, and someone said it in a meeting and it stuck with me. They said, the job of a leader is forging the new normal, the new normal. So I've been holding those two sort of leadership ideas in my head over the last couple of months and thinking about it. And then you put with it what we've heard from our colleagues. There was a time pre-COVID. Now, in New Zealand, it was a time of constant challenge of different sorts. And Gabrielle's talked about some of the other challenges that keep coming. So yes, pre-COVID, and we'll always have challenges to face. Then there was the early COVID phase. And I remember that as adrenaline. I remember that as that acute, adrenaline-filled, heroic, selfless, morale was high. That was something, but it's different now. And I've got these words of, we need to be stronger for longer. How do we do that? And there's a whole sense of disillusionment, grief, exhaustion around. And so I think this rebuild for me is recognizing some of that context, recognizing where we're at, putting away those superhero clothes that some people, we put on for a while, and it was important. I think there's something, if we're going to use the All Blacks, one of the wonderful things about the All Blacks is they have reserves. They don't just build a first team, they build a second team and a third team, and any of them can move between. So who's on our bench? How are we going to cycle them through? If this is the second half, perhaps, who are our finishers who are going to come on and take it forward just as strong as we did in the first half? We've got to remember not to lose the great stories. I can feel tiredness coming in, and people around me are still doing brilliant things, but we're not collecting them as we did. I looked back during the Great Depression. There were some great examples of what happened at this sort of stage. And there was a furniture company called Herman Miller. And they said that this is the point where we start to create the future. But to do that, we've got to see what's happening now. And they invented water carriers, people who carried water around all the staff. And as they gave them water, they asked them, what's your story? And those stories started to build the next version of Herman Miller as it came. And that really inspires me, because I think I'd stopped listening to stories as much as I had done at the beginning. So I'm back into stories. So I'd say that. The next one is partnerships. Let's not lose those partnerships we forged in the acute phase. The partnerships, I love hearing Kariana talking to her entire community. That's frayed a bit for us too. So across sector. And then I would say public and private partnerships. They worked brilliantly for me in the first 6 months, and we've sort of stepped away a little bit. So how do we forge those public-private partnerships? And the last partnership I just wanted to flag up is the global one. So thank you for bringing us together today. There's always a risk that this will drop away, that we'll become a little isolated, like I think I heard Joran hinting at, as well as local community, we lose our international community and friends. And this backdrop here that I made last night, well, one of my colleagues made, is showing that our dragon is following just behind your young leaders. That's your young leaders logo at the front of it. We're right there with you. We're hanging on to your coattails to try and keep going forward together. So almost finished, but what I'd say is another great teacher that I had the pleasure of training with was a man called John Kabat-Zinn. And he said, this moment is a bridge to the future challenges. And I would just say that the work we're doing together around building young leaders, the celebration we're doing in this conference, and I hope others, I'm working with another New Zealand group, the Hillary Institute, and we're aiming to build some international Hillary Awards for some of these brilliant people across the world at base camp and at the summit, who are really leading us forward. And I think those are really important as we try to build something unique for these unique times. So I'm going to pause there. Lots more to talk about, lots about mountains and climbing mountains and being in the death zone at the top of a mountain. We can talk forever, but I'll pause there and give you time to move on to someone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan, you've given me so much. It's all the material for a leadership class, but I love it. You say build reserves, build stories. I love stories. All right. And then build partnerships, and then don't become insular. Make sure that we keep connected to the global community. Yoran is still not back. All right. That is the role of a leader. He has to run off, manage a fire that's burning, and he will be back. But do not fear. I have questions galore coming up. We have one that just came in from the audience, and I couldn't help but have to get it out there, because all of you are leaders in the trenches. You've lived. Oh, Goran is back. Sorry. Zamin, your question has to wait. All right. Because we really want to hear from Yoran. Yoran, how's the fire? Have you put it off? Very good. So I was just finishing up with Jonathan about the rebuild. And I would love to have you kind of share with us very quickly, if we were to rebuild what we have learned and to be better prepared for the way ahead. What would you start to consciously tell us to rebuild right now? I think you're muted, Yoran. Yoran, you're muted. Yes. The fire.
Yes.
Yes.
You said conscious, and that's another code. That's true. I think it's very important. Let me say that we have learned so much through the pandemic about the need of moving from inside out in all definitions to outside in, and therefore clinical science is not enough. We need population science, and we have started to collaborate with the communities in a completely new way, because we understand that we have to go much more upstreams and work much more intensively with prevention in the communities where we find the population that gets COVID easier than other groups of population or inhabitants or citizens. And we have done a program where we find the patients when they are positive and bring oximeters to them and reduce the risk that they come in too late to the hospital. And instead of going to the intensive care, they stay 3-4 days at the hospital and go home and get better without any support from our system. This is made by a better statistical understanding. So we work much more with prediction, and we have done it now in COVID, and we do it now in sepsis, and we are convinced that we can do this in many areas in a completely new way. And we have got so much support from all levels or care levels by doing this. So I see that this is a fantastic learning phase in our work that the COVID brings.
Thank you. And I think JJ, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Yoran said. I think this whole, I mean, you know, the unique thing about COVID is that the most common symptom is an upper respiratory tract infection. Suddenly, upper respiratory tract symptoms becomes the most important symptom in the country. And therefore, I think, at least in Singapore, it has managed to bring up this idea that, you know, primary care is actually very, very important. We need to prepare primary care for some of these future epidemics, that we need to train them, we need to equip them well, And whether public or private, I think we need to involve everyone. And because primary care is actually, and the community care is actually the first line of defense. And if we do it well, then I think we will spare the hospital of a lot of casualties. And I think we find that the situation is much better controlled when we start our home recovery program, as Joran has, similar to the program in Sweden, where some of the GPs will be monitoring the patients with pulse oximeter and all that. But I think that there was a bit of slowness in the beginning, and I think it's because we have had the gap between tertiary care and primary care, and I think that this crisis will teach us that in all that we do, we need to involve everyone. And I think no one is more superior or more important. I think everybody is part of the ecosystem, and without the other partner, I think we're just not going to win the war.
Very nice. Yeah. So all of you, all right, I'm not going to get away from the upcoming question, because everyone says you sound like wonderful leaders and you seem so sane and so controlled and so professional. So therefore, this question is more for the individual leader in each and every one of you. And you could jump in anytime. So, what keeps you going in times of crisis, in downtime, besides drinking coffee? What keeps you going? What keeps you ticking? Any one of you, just put your hand up. Who wants to go first? Okay. Oh, sorry, Joran. I let the lady go first. Kariana first. What keeps you going?
Well, I'd just like to let everybody know I can't abide the taste of coffee. So coffee isn't what keeps me going. I'm actually hardwired to finish, so it's just something that I've learned about myself. So I do have this internal drive that keeps me going. But ultimately, I live in a beautiful part of New Zealand, and I get to wake up every morning in a beautiful part of New Zealand. I get to go out into the gardens. I get to hear the tuis. I mean, that's a beautiful thing to experience every day. So drive, not coffee, garden, keeps me going.
And how do you manage crisis and downtimes and disappointments?
Yes, well, my Nana Max taught me very young that this too will pass. So she also taught me that some days you're the statue and other days you're the pigeon. And I think you just have to, for me, you need to maintain your perspective, and you need to proportionally respond. Because if you do treat everything like a nail and you're the hammer, then that doesn't allow you to grow. So I think from my perspective, I have tried to instill in my children as well that when you're facing something, you need to ask yourself, is this the worst thing that can happen to me? Is this the worst thing that can happen to us? Is this the worst thing that's happening right now? And generally the answer to all of those three questions is no.
Very good. Thank you very much, Kariana. Joran, your hand was as fast as Kariana. What keeps you going, and how do you tackle downtimes?
To really understand what I say is to read this book from a Dutch philosopher, Rutger Bregman, and about humankind. And I'm so privileged that I work with the life, and healthcare is a social science, most of all. And we are here to help people to stay as active as possible, as long as possible. And it's a privilege to be part of that and build a society that can become their own owners of their own life.
So the purpose is there, then, but you are human. So what do you do when there is a downtimes, when you face disappointments?
I think that then it's even more important to be the humankind. And I think that we sometimes forget that it's through compassion and kindness that we really get good services. So it starts with care is about kindness and compassion and life.
Thank you, Joran. Jonathan.
Thank you. Just
keeps
to follow.
What keeps you going, and how do you handle challenging, difficult crisis times?
Fantastic question. And for me, I think we've all practiced this now a lot over the last 18 months. And I think reaching out to others, I think that connection of family and friends has really been driven home as you know, so vital. And we hear that in the other answers, prioritizing those relationships, not withdrawing. I know everybody, well, I certainly sometimes want that day in bed with the covers over my head, maybe watching another box set of Netflix, and maybe occasionally that's allowed and that's okay, but generally, you know, get out there. You've got to keep engaging, keep networking. I've started to avoid negative people recently. I'm testing that. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm trying that because there's so much negativity around, and I'm just trying to limit my time in negativity, expand my social networks. I've forced myself, even before I get to retirement, I've forced myself to take up golf and tennis and run every week. It's killing me, but I'm meeting so many more people, and I'm really enjoying that sense of, you know, it feels like work isn't quite so bad. Then just to balance it and show that, you know, you all know I'm slightly mad, but I'm trying to practice acceptance. And I'm trying just to sit with it sometimes and sit with that acceptance of, you know, the grief, the loss, the tiredness. And I love Kariana's comments there, you know, that, you know, this too will pass. And lastly, the bit that my wife's been trying to teach me is to keep looking for that meaning and purpose. And usually I find that in trying to help other people. You know, I keep forgetting it in myself, but when you're doing that, helping others, celebrating their wins, I re-find that purpose that brings us back. So a couple of ideas there. Thanks.
And we saw another question coming in. Jonathan, you talk about acting into new doing, making life so good. Yes. So I think it resonates with a lot of people. Yoran's question, did it, to Jonathan? Yeah, very nice. I'm going to jump to either Gabriel or JJ. All right, you guys were very quiet when it comes to, all right, how do you manage? All right, and what do you wake up to? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first then.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess what keeps me going, you know, besides family and all that, is really I have a very good team of what I would call my comrades, my close colleagues who work with me in clinical leadership. I think that we're like-minded, and but we when we are together, we don't hold back, and we discuss, and they're all very effective. I think working with people like this keeps me going. They re-energize me, and I think that together our collective work, you know, we can see the results, you know, that the impact it has on the hospital itself. I think that what's also I'm also privileged in the sense that I still see patients. So I think listening to some of my patients, I'm a geriatrician, so I listen to my patients' stories of how, you know, as you know, the elderly are one of the worst hit in this whole, not just the from disease aspect, but I think the psychological isolation, the loneliness, and all that. And you listen to some of the stories of how they adapt, you know, how they actually learn to even use Zoom to exercise together and so forth. I think these are the stories that kind of inspires you and re-energizes me. And even when I feel down, you know, you just thinking about how some of these people cope with difficulties, sort of rejuvenates you.
Thank you. What about your dog? Does the dog help?
Yeah, the dog helps, you know, because the dog never argues back. Yeah. And I think, yeah, dogs are just therapeutic. Pets in general are therapeutic. Yeah.
Thank you, JJ. Gabriel, what keeps you going?
A belief in what I do, a belief in the people who I work with, and the belief above all that we are working towards a greater good. And that really is what keeps me going and what makes me wake up and feel energized. And that's, I think, in a word, what it has always been. And that has been a huge help for me through the last couple of years.
And how do you handle those moments when even the belief is not enough because you do have challenges and moments of disappointments?
Good friends. And of course, comfort food always helps, as does the gym, in equal measure.
And comfort food with good friends. I think that's the double. Yeah. Thank you very much. You know, I have another question here. We hear that resilience is running out. It seems to be across all countries. Yet we need to be stronger, longer, quoting the words from all of you. And we need to be prepared, not just in time and just in case. So how do you think as leaders we can prepare ourselves and our workforce to do this? We don't have a lot of extra reserves and the reserves are running low. So if I were to pose that statement to you right now from the words that you've all used, at this point in time, how do you prepare your team, your workforce for a long race? Because we don't know if it's going to be cleared and for BAU as usual. Any one of you? Joran?
I think that we have prepared this during the 2 years. We have understood so much more about the need of reflection time, huddles. We have priests or other people that are strong in existential health to support groups if they want to debrief how the work works. And when we were in the most intense phase, we had it not as an option, we had it as a must. We also have a completely new way of thinking about distance work. So for people that are not serving the patients, we have today much more liberal rules around being on your workplace or not. And that brings, of course, new challenges, but also a freedom to plan your work in a different way. And we have seen very good effects among especially parents that have young children, that they could divide the daily work a little based on their wholeness and not on the workplace wholeness. So I think it's very promising that we find new ways of trying to achieve performance, but with new tools.
Very nice. So beyond just healthcare, it's about new ways of work, new ways of parenting, new ways of balancing your life and work. Yeah. Yes. So, you know, investing in that now, even though it may not be just preparing for the pandemic. Any one of you? For that long race. Yes, Kariana?
Yeah, I was also going, when I arrived in Hawke's Bay last August, in our hospital, 58% of our staff do not work full time. And that figure has increased, and we are talking about now the term the retirement phenomenon, where a large number of people are still choosing to work, but they're working in quite a different way. And when you're in a health system and you're trying to determine rosters and availability, the fact that we are now seeing our workforce moving into this more thoughtfully planned part-time but still working type of availability. I do think it's both our answer for staying stronger longer, but it's also we now have to reimagine at pace the way in which we're going to allocate our resources over a 24/7 service provision. It may feel like we've been doing this progressively over the last couple of decades, but I really think it's hit a flashpoint.
So as leaders, we are not now open to ways in which we could allow staff to work and choosing their own working hours. I like that. Jonathan, your hand was up.
Thanks. Just a couple of things on that resilience. I think that we have to actively build wide-scale resilience in our systems, and I think there's a couple of things that we can try to do around that. I think one is that how do we renew it? How do we unleash the energy within that resilience? We've talked about some of the self-care things we can do, but I think as a workplace we can also work with people to reimagine work, and I think that's to Joran's point, but also reimagine the workplace, which I heard in Kerry-Anna's answer, and reimagine that workforce of the future. And I think linking people from now to where it could go starts to get into that bounded optimism I mentioned earlier. It's a different conversation. Yes, we've lost things, but we're going to acknowledge that, accept it. What are the steps towards a possible future that I can engage your energy in? And then just quickly, I'd put alongside that, something we're seeing a lot is as leaders, as we tire, we stop walking around and talking to people. We talked about stories, but I'm really fascinated by those, those walking tours that reconnect all of us that spend our lives on Zoom. So that reconnection that comes with a walking tour, and maybe asking a critical question or making a point that it's okay to not be okay, is a huge thing in my organization at the moment. Someone sometimes has to say that and allow people to be okay to not be okay. So
have you said that before, Jonathan? Have you said that to your team?
We're constantly taking that into conversations at the moment, because maybe it could be cultural, but I see it a lot here. We have quick conversations in the corridor, and how are you? Fine, excellent, great. But actually, how do you find time in this really tough time to allow people not to be okay? And would we notice if they didn't quite say, okay, I'm great, with enough enthusiasm? How do we have those conversations? And we're trying to walk and talk and give space for those not being okay conversations.
Thank you very much. Give space and time to those not okay conversations. JJ.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I was saying at the beginning that to you before the start, that actually one of the things that people find intolerable about this whole pandemic is the sort of monotony and the boredom, and being told every day this is what you can do, and being told every day the same thing that you cannot do, and it's just continuing. And I think it's important that at least what we've done in the hospital is to try to allow some normality to go on and to discuss about plans about what's going to be important to us after the crisis, after this whole thing has ended. Because if we don't, then it looks as if this is going to go on forever and ever. It's like telling the kids, we're not there yet, but when we get there, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I think ironically, people get energized by this kind of work, and we talk about the plans that we're going to have, and get people involved in projects and all that. No doubt people are tired. We do that in the right proportion, but I think that it would be a mistake to say that we're now in a crisis, let's not do anything else. Let's stop, innovate, and let's stop all conferences and all that, and just focus on the crisis. I think there are times during this crisis where we have to do that. But I think once there are some capacity, people actually want some variation in their work life that will give them that meaning and purpose and energy and that optimism, as Jonathan has said, that this is not going to be for eternity, and this is not going to be like, I've got 5 years left before retirement. COVID hopefully should end before my retirement ends, and I would have some normal professional life before that. Yeah. And somebody was just mentioning that, all these masks, I don't even know what my colleague looks like unless I eat with the person. And I think that, this is really, I think many of us are crying out because we have lost that social, the socialization angle. We come to work not just because of work, we come to work also to socialize. And I think we need to do our very best to introduce that social element into the work life in spite of the many constraints.
Very
and
good.
I think that would help us to pull through this whole crisis.
Thank you. Now that we have been telling people we have only 15 minutes left, the questions are coming in fast and furious. So I'm not going to ask Gabriel that same question. I think we've got some great ideas. Gabriel, I need this one from you. We are heading towards a more divided workforce, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, with differentiated scopes of work, different privileges, different outlooks. How can you as a leader manage this potential division?
Tough. And I think that leaders have a role, but I think building that sense of solidarity, which was my one word nutshell from last year, applies even more. Secondly, I think, for the audience here, I assume that all of us come from the global north. It never fails to amaze to imagine that we are in a privileged minority of having access to vaccines. And I think that can be a very powerful message to people to appeal to their sense of being in a privileged position relative to others who are in the global village. And I think that, that can be much more effective and persuasive than any vaccine mandate. And third, as a leader, and the more senior you get, the more unpalatable your decisions may sometimes be. And some of us actually have had to impose and issue vaccine mandates. And that, I think is a necessary condition, but one that shouldn't be exercised lightly. Because there will always be that last mile on that curve of diminishing returns. And I think that that's when we hit the very fine balance of weighing the collective public good versus individual autonomy. And so I think that so long as we are open, honest, and transparent about these decisions, and also bring in fresh perspectives, which often get lost in the noise of everyday life, I think that that's really the key to resolving potential division or divisiveness. There is too much populism, even tribalism in this world, and we need to build back in a better and more robustly sharing and equitable world.
Okay, one final question from the audience, and then I'm going to do 2 rounds with all of you. So this question, any one of you could jump in. There has been an exodus of healthcare staff in many countries. And what have been through some of the parting conversations you had with those who have left? What have they told you, and how can we stem that outflow of talent from the healthcare sector? Any one of you? We've seen some in Singapore as well, right? But we have also seen a lot of people wanting to get into healthcare, especially public health, from the young ones. So, but I do not know what the outflow and the inflow would finally look like. But what are some of the ways that you could stem the exodus? And I think, Jonathan, you were making a very good point about our future leaders as well. How to get people to step up and be healthcare leaders. Maybe, Jonathan, we start with you.
Two very quick ideas that you'll understand them all. One is we've got to have a unique approach to young leaders and not do what we historically did, which was give leadership training to our already more senior. We've not invested in the young leaders and built that reusable, innovative, cross-generational, cross-silo capacity. System leadership for young people, the ones who ran towards the fire. The other idea, though, that we're playing with, and I'd be fascinated to do with you, is when people retire, I'm getting loads of people saying they want to do some work back with us. And we historically, I lose 300 people a month here in my organization retiring. Many of them we don't celebrate enough, and we certainly don't give the opportunity to come back. So I'd like them to carry on working for the system. How do I keep those recently and later retired people contributing back?
Any more from any of you? How do we stem that outflow? How do we continue to engage the retired? Yes, Kiriana?
So this may be unique to New Zealand, but one of the things we're really grappling with at the moment is the systemic pay equity differences we have in our health system between those professions or functions that are delivered predominantly by women. So I think one of the things that we could do in New Zealand is settle our pay equity differences amongst our health professionals, and we would probably retain a lot more of our workforce. Kia ora.
Thank you very much. JJ or Gabriel or Yoran?
Well, I think
Yoran. Yeah.
I think this is a good sign, because this is young people loves to be leaders, but they love to be leaders in promising systems and promising organizations. And I believe that this is just a sign that we have to hurry up and accelerate the definition of what is important and meaningful in our work. And it is a system infection and not a people problem. So I think it's great that we are challenged by this question.
Very nice. And, I've been given all the signals and signs that I've got to do the last round. So I shall be a good moderator, all right, and not the rebel that JJ was trying to infer. And we're going to start a little bit like a round robin, all right? I do have specific questions. So JJ, I'll start with you first. All right, what would your advice be for future leaders, especially the ones that have been working on the trenches with you, and had to work with all this uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that the future leaders would have to be adaptive, and they have to be adaptable. They need to be able to handle. I think one of the things about clinicians is that we don't handle ambiguity very well, and I think people want instructions to be either black or white, and people can't handle grayness, and therefore I think people need to understand and understand appreciation of nuances and context is very important. And that sort of I mean, I don't know whether it's a consequence of sometimes the training we've received since in school days and all that. But I think that while medical science is a scientific discipline, but I think that when we translate and operationalize at the ground, we really need to be able to understand some of the ambiguities, and be able to live with them, and to be able to still be able to deliver the care effectively. And therefore, I think that's one. The other thing I think is that there has to be an increase in the awareness of how important transformation and innovation is in our work, sort of system thinking, design thinking, and all that. I think clinicians take a long time to train to do what they are doing, and they are often resistant to change. Because I've taken 10 years to learn this skill, and now you want me to do it a different way, there is always resistance. But I think that has to change, and that kind of attitude has to be inculcated very early in the training, and so that they become more adaptable and be able to use technology. So I just want to give an example. For example, during this COVID period, we suddenly using, for example, telemedicine as a service extender. Yeah, but I know that there are many people who say once COVID is off, we're going to go back to the. Yeah, I think that we certainly, this is a reset that we need to do. That we need to look at technology as an enabler that will continue to improve our work, and therefore, getting people that nurturing that mindset about transformation and innovation using technologies and all that, it certainly becomes, I think it should be a core sort of competency in most clinicians.
Thank you very much, JJ. Gabriel, I'm going to personalize your advice for future leaders, because we've heard about your succession and living well plan. So you're going to be leaving, all right, the healthcare sector, and your advice would even be more appropriate.
Well, I mean, I think that young leaders need to be nurtured. There are very, very few born leaders. And I think that we need to recognize that and stop looking for Olympic godlike figures. And that's why, honestly, I do this panel year after year, because I believe that places like CHAI is so important in nurturing young leaders. And we have to recognize that they come in all shapes and sizes, and that by definition, when you are a leader already, you actually are more or less out of touch with the people whom you lead. And that's why we need to make sure that there is very good succession planning and give people the comfort zone where they can do it their way while you still are behind them with the training wheels. And let them do as much as they can. And even when you think that they are doing the wrong thing, support them, and they might very pleasantly surprise you. And so all I have to say is trust them, have faith in them, give them wings, and they'll fly higher than all of us.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. We're going to miss you. All right, but we'll still bring you back, because Jonathan said nobody retires from this panel. Kariana, women leaders, how do you address and what advice do you give them as future leaders?
I always like them to reflect on being very wise on pace and grace. So for me, there's something about the world and the way the world's turning, but you can actually walk your way through this world being as graceful as you can be. I've got kind of three things for me. I think you should always bring the best version of yourself to work every day, and you should be really clear on the days that's not possible. I think if you're hardwired to deliver like me, you need to really practice leaving space for the matter to breathe, because not everything needs to be resolved by you. And sometimes things resolve themselves. And my final piece of advice is you need to practice and then put into practice the art of giving and receiving feedback. I don't think we practice enough. And I often think that we listen to reply instead of listening to understand. So I'd like people to practice that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kariana. Such wise words and said with grace. Jonathan, your advice to future leaders, especially in preparing all our leaders for further bumps and resilience in the road.
Absolutely. change happens at the speed of trust. So I'm intrigued by, how I would encourage and help and support young leaders to cultivate relationships and networks. And that's the joy, like Gabriel says, of being linked to yourselves. How do we join people up, and how can I help my young leaders meet your young leaders in this wonderful space? Then there's a few practical things that we always end up talking about. I ask them to attend to their relaxation, attend to sleeping, and attend to eating, because I think that often gets lost. And then most recently, I found myself, I was taking notes, giving advice on taking time off, checking your busyness, because there seems to be still a huge demand for busyness, not productivity. And finally, declining meetings that don't add special value.
Especially from negative people. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Don't go to any of those.
And you get the last word, Yoran, your advice to our future leaders to stay the cloth, because the journey is going to be long.
You have told us just one sentence, so I do one sentence, but I have to explain the sentence after that. I think the key is go out and harvest. I think my ideal work is to become a farmer, taking care of the context, the soil, and at the same time understand that different soil needs different kind of ways of doing things. And there is a big risk now when we have this COVID and isolation situation that we lose that maybe most important thing, that things can be done with the same result in many different ways. And to develop that thinking you have to be a farmer and go out and see how you change your methods depending on what kind of soil you have. So I think promote people to see the world and love the differences. They will become strong leaders.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so privileged. We have such humble leaders on this panel, and I'm so delighted that Chai or Chi, all right, however you call it, have actually hosted this panel. And I think the words behind CHI absolutely resonated with everyone here. We got where we are because of a center, but that center led to collaboration across so many parts of the world. We are where we are today because we have a passion and a love for healthcare. We have gone beyond healthcare to health. And a lot of us are willing to admit that we don't have the answers, but we are all coming together to share. We have gone from healthcare to innovation as well. And innovation is needed because our future leaders expect it from us. But we are also integrated together in this future learning journey. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, can we warmly thank our sterling panel? And I'm going to pass the Chai chair back to Hung Tim. Professor Wong, please.
Thank you very much, Annie.
Thank you.
Ariana, to Jonathan, Yoran, Gabriel, and JJ. It's been, again, a wonderful reunion and very, very rich exchange. It does seem that managing mindsets and managing ourselves is just as complex and difficult as managing the virus on its own. So thank you very much for that wonderful exchange. David's on screen with me now, the Executive Director of CHI. And David, what are your thoughts of today and the whole conference series?
Oh, wow. What a way, right, to close or really, different paradigm, open our innovate conversations. So really, thank you very much. If I may just, bring about the closure to the installments, Hong Tim, to all of us today, and to also the previous sessions, right? I mean, we have had Healthcare InnoMatch and the very inspiring center stage speakers, if you manage to have be in their sessions with Aaron, Maniam, as well as Melissa. Now, 2021 has been very, very challenging. It has challenged our assumptions of a new normal. But what is normal? While we struggle as individuals to define this, the leadership panel has given us hope. We don't need to define it. We just need to be incredibly human. These too will pass. Yeah, so walk together to innovate iteratively a better future. I do hope that you've enjoyed and benefited from the invaluable insights from so many of our wonderful speakers and panelists. And of course, if you want to relive many of these sessions, you can always tune into our CHI YouTube channel. Tim?
Great, thank you. And in the new world, we need to take a Wi-Fi, Zoom Wi-Fi, so could get everybody to put on the best smiles, and we'll do that. So my team here is going to take that Wi-Fi. Let me know when it's done. Great. Thank you. And to the audience, we hope you've really enjoyed today's panel as well. I need that panel to stay on just for a little while more. For the audience, please don't forget to rate today's session and also drop us your comments on the chat as well. This whole conference series would not have been possible without unwavering support from a very fantastic scientific committee, which I was privileged to be part of. So a very, very big thank you goes to this wonderful team that you can see on your screen now. I'm going to mention their names one by one because they deserve very, very individualized and special mentions. So thank you to Erwin, to Tamsin, to Melanie from CHI, of course, Chawei from Philips, Douglas, Franklin, Justina, Sweet Fun, and Alex. Thank you all very, very much for sticking with us through a crazy year of ups and downs, ons and offs, and starts and restarts as well. And there's also a huge team that stands next to me. I'm not in a void on my own. There's a huge team around me right now. And this is that wonderful CHI team that has brought everything together. We've worked really, really hard to bring this to you. I hope it was worth it, and we'll do it again next year. David?
Yeah, Tim, you and I know, right? I think, but there were so many people who are working so hard, right, in the background. And you mentioned Melanie. So, Melanie, Tina, Charmaine, Esmond, can you all please stand up and take a virtual bow? After 2 years of learning from our Innovate journey, we will be back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger would say, right, in 2022. But we will convert our conference into modules that will occur throughout the year. So stay tuned for our new plans coming up soon. In the meantime, keep safe and keep innovating.
Goodbye, everyone.